Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is February 23rd, 2021. I'm Steve Shields, President of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to lecture number 1436. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered at London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea. We appreciate your support. Without your membership, we would not be able to host the lecture series or conduct our other activities. If you are not yet a member, we request a one-time admission fee of 10,000 won or $10. Full-time student rate is 5,000 won or $5. Please refer to the donation page on the screen for detailed information as to how to make that donation. Having said that, we'd rather you join us as a member. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you the opportunity to support an organization whose main purpose for over 120 years has been to explore and promote all facets of Korea's rich heritage. You also have the opportunity to meet leading scholars and other interesting people in the field of Korean studies. Members receive discounts on RAS books, and you receive our annual journal, Transactions. See our website at raskb.com for more information. In a minute, I'll post a link in the chat box as well. We are delighted to have with us tonight David Tizzard, who holds a Ph.D. in Korean Studies. He's an assistant professor at Seoul Women's University and a visiting lecturer at Hanyang University, also in Seoul. Dr. Tizzard is a frequent commentator on Korean issues, appearing in a variety of publications and media channels discussing culture, politics, and societal questions. He is an artist and a musician who has performed in South Korea for the past 15 years. After the lecture, we will have time for questions. So now, if you will be sure that your mics are muted, we'll go to Dr. Tizzard.
Thank you for the introduction, Steve. Everybody can hear me and see me, I take it. That's looking well. Good evening, everybody, or morning, afternoon, wherever you might be in the world. I'm going to share my screen now, so let's see if technology is on our side. Steve, are you seeing that?
Just a second. Yes, we got it. Yep.
Excellent.
Looks good.
If it doesn't move, let me know. I'm hoping this will be a moving thing. Hello, everybody. Thank you to the Royal Asiatic Society for having me. This is my second lecture here, and I'm always very honored, very grateful for their invitations. I hope to do it more in the future. And for those of you that have joined us here this evening, I would also suggest to you to support the RAS however you can, whether that's on social media, by liking and sharing the posts, telling your friends. We live in uncertain times, and everything we can do to help support this excellent organization, I think, is for the benefit in the long term. I don't have a script for tonight's presentation. I'm going to speak on the fly. I prefer the spontaneity. It means original things come out. It means sometimes things get forgotten, but nevertheless. As way of just a very brief introduction, Steve already gave one, but my name is David Tizzard, and I will be approaching this from three different ways. I just want to give you that background. So in terms of academia, I teach the Korean Wave, I teach Hallyu at two different universities, and I've just recently finished teaching a course on K-pop to students from all around the world just a couple of weeks ago, it taught me a couple of things, because we had students from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, China, Hong Kong, all coming live for 6 hours a day. For some of them, it was the middle of the night. For some of them, it was the morning. But what it demonstrated was the power of Korean culture right now, that around the world, this attraction to Korean things, this desire to learn about things, the way students were sort of giving up their winter vacations or summer vacations in the southern hemisphere to study these things, was undeniable. It was real. And they were very different, the students, from their backgrounds, from their histories and their interests. So the interest in Korean culture, Korean things, has never been higher. I realized that from my own experiences. One of the things we will come to later, though, Steve touched on it briefly, is that I do, working as a musician, working as an artist, I do sometimes listen to K-pop and look at these with an artist's ear. And I think that sometimes gets lost in a lot of academia. There's something to be said for the aesthetics, rather than sort of dry academic analysis. Sometimes we need to go with what moves us. So by that way of brief introduction, I'm going to introduce now, or at least try to, 3 postmodern concepts. Now, I can't teach postmodernity to people in such a short period of time, and I don't want to overburden you, but I'm going to try to give you 3 concepts, and those 3 concepts will become a tool for the rest of the things that I talk about. The first concept that I would like to introduce is this idea of truth. Now, in a modern society, there is this idea that there is a singular truth. Of course, we know the fable, the parable of the blind men and the elephant, and they all believe that they have the answer to what this thing might be, a rope, a wall, a tree, and such forth. They all have different ideas. However, by combining the information, by using rational thought and logic, by using data and empiricism, modern society posits or tells us that there is a singular or a single truth that can be obtained through the correct methods. When we enter postmodernity, postmodernity suggests, in contradiction to modernity, that there is no singular truth, that something can be A and triangle at the same time, not even A and B, not even square and triangle, but things can be completely different from each other. Moreover, truths can contradict each other. Now, that's not necessarily something that is very easily understood if we live in a modern society, but for postmodernity, contradictory truths is very much a part of the analysis. And because there is no one truth, these various truths, they battle for survival, akin to sort of in a Colosseum, in a Darwinian or evolutionary struggle for the survival of the fittest, because it's not the truth's inherent quality, which means it will survive, but rather how it competes with the other truths in this environment. So the first thing that I would suggest when we take postmodernity to look at K-pop and the Korean wave is that there is not a singular truth, but rather there are truths. Before I do the other two, I will just very briefly say that by doing this, I'm not championing postmodernism or I'm not denigrating postmodernism. My interest is, can it be used as a tool to understand what we see in the world around us? That's where my interests really lie. The second thing I would like to give you is this idea of paradigm shifts. This comes from Thomas Kuhn. You'll also see it in Michel Foucault's Episteme. To explain this, that PPT is a bit smaller than I imagined. And take 2 people living side by side in an apartment, not the same room, but they're in neighboring apartments. You have Mrs. Jimenez and Mr. Choi. Now, they live in the same space. They live in the same time. They live in the same culture. But postmodernism might posit that they could be living in essentially different worlds. They could be living in different paradigms. that doesn't seem to make sense because spatially and temporally, they're so close to each other. Yet when new ideas or when new technology enter, different people embrace these new ideas and technology. They embrace it earlier than other people. And therefore, two people living side by side, when they see a singular object, they could react differently to it. It could give them different ideas, different codes, different signifiers, different cultural responses. And it could be any number of things that they react differently to. So they're living side by side, but they're essentially in different worlds. And therefore, it becomes hard to communicate across that paradigm. It becomes hard to communicate across that different sort of chasm. And I personally find it interesting to see that these different paradigms appear not through technology, not necessarily through smartphones or the internet, although of course that is very true, but rather through ideas. And I say that because we have smartphones and internet virtually in most of the world now. Of course, there are different stages of development. But if you were to take, for example, Western Europe and South Korea, whereas the technology might be very similar, the ideas or the acceptance of certain ideas is very different. We can see that with attitudes towards, let's say, LGBTQ issues, whether it be cohabitation, whether it be abortion, attitudes towards race, and such forth. So these are ideas that come into society and they create different paradigms, different worlds, and then people struggle to communicate across those. So that's the second. The first being multiple truths. The second being that people inhabit different worlds and therefore see the world differently according to the ideas that they have. The third one would be the rise of identity as an important part of any process. Now, traditionally, take Confucius, take Plato, there's a sage king, there's a philosopher king. Certain people are best equipped to discover the truth. These people might be based on their profession, based on their study, based on their gender, based on their race or ethnicity and such forth. But the traditional view would have been that certain people are in our society are best equipped to discover the truth, and therefore they should be given precedence when seeking answers, when seeking to know what is going on. From that, we developed into this idea of universalism, where everybody is equal, where the differences do not matter. We all, if we look at liberalism with J.S. Mill and such forth, we all have the capability for rational thought. So we are therefore all equal. We are all capable of discovering the truth, regardless of our occupation, regardless of our profession, socioeconomic class, gender, and such forth. However, in postmodernity, and this is the third one, one's identity matters. One's journey, one's experience matters, and it provides people with different perspectives. It provides people with different knowledge. And the identity matters in terms of your socioeconomic status, in terms of your race or ethnicity, in terms of your sexual orientation, in terms of your job, in terms of your whatever it might be. We could look at sort of that intersectional idea. But identity has become a very important thing, and it highlights differences, and it suggests that different experiences can bring people closer to truths and other people further away from truths according to their own identity. So there's three things there in postmodernity that I think kind of characterize a lot of postmodern thought. Of course, it's much deeper and richer than that, whether you look at sort of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and the developments of it. But multiple truths, people living in different worlds based on different ideas and values, and identity being an important marker of who we are. These are the three things which have stuck with me and which I try to look at how this unfolds. So those three things. Now, I'm sure most of you already know this, Korean culture and K culture are incredibly different. K culture, the K primarily designates that something will be for export overseas. So recently it's been K Bangyo, K quarantine. I did a documentary interview for government thing, but they're promoting that overseas to different countries now. We have not just quarantine, but we have K quarantine. So this K designates that something is coming from Korea and going abroad. And when these things go abroad, they're normally designed, they're glocalized, they're hybrids to get maximum appeal, because now when they go abroad, they're not just looking, for example, at Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, Eastern Europe. They're looking at the entire world. And so the more neutral or the more hybrid that these things are, whether it's films, music, dramas, food, literature, the more hybrid it is, the more possibilities for success that it has. I would also suggest that a lot of K culture is self-congratulatory. It's rather clean. It talks about the good things. Whereas Korean culture, it's more idiosyncratic. It's that combination of traditional and post-colonial. There's a lot of nationalism and a lot of local Korean culture, whether it's in webtoons, whether it's in music or literature, it's becoming more critical of the problems that it sees here in society, whether that's with birth rates, gender discrepancies, kapjil, the abuse of power. So I think it's important just to differentiate those two, that what goes abroad is not necessarily Korean culture, but a specific version of Korean culture designed for export. If you use social media, you know what your real face looks like, and you know what the selfie photo that you use for the public world. They're different, and Korean culture and K culture might be a little bit like that. Now, when we look at K culture, or Hallyu, again, that's an externally created name. If you read through the academic literature, you read through the peer-reviewed journals and papers, you'll notice that different people use different definitions. So you'll read one paper in Hallyu, it will proudly proclaim that we're in Hallyu 4.0. And then you'll read another paper and it will say, well, this is Hallyu 2.0. So it's very difficult to get a grasp on what is actually happening. Now, with this export of Korean products abroad, some people, and these categorizations I've made, you can hopefully see on the screen, these are not mine, but rather these are what I've read in various peer-reviewed papers in the academic literature. So some people will say that Hallyu goes through different stages according to the product that is produced. It starts with the dramas and Winter Sonata and such forth, then becomes K-pop, broader K culture. Other people try to analyze it through geographic reception. So the more it spreads, this shows the different changes in Hallyu, in the K culture. Other people would suggest we're just in Hallyu 2.0 because the revolutions or evolutions are determined by the medium through which it is distributed. CDs and videotapes, analog, internet, we're still there. Other people look for these more sort of intrinsic qualities, jong and hung, to define it. One of the points being that Hallyu is defined differently by different people, and there is no consensus to it. But if there were, who would give that consensus? Who would define Hallyu? The international, the domestic? That's a point I think worth looking at. In terms of its success, I think this is really important to point out, because let's say a tired criticism or an overworked one is that it is just the product of the government. It's government sponsored, it's government paid, and it's thrown abroad. I think most of the literature and the reality suggests it's exactly the opposite is happening right now. So we have South Korean entertainment companies, whether they're movie, dramas, music, they're producing things, and they've always been producing things for the last few decades. And Whether the quality is increasing or just the available capital is increasing is a different question. But what has changed is the international reception. Korea has always been making K-pop for export abroad. But what's happened all of a sudden is that the number of international fans picking up on it has increased. So this is not necessarily the companies doing a lot of things different. It's not the government doing anything different, but rather it's the fans from abroad that have pulled K-pop up. So it's a bottom-up cultural movement, and it's driven more by, I would suggest, external factors rather than domestic. So in that sense, in terms of the government, we could posit the South Korean government as a client state of Hallyu. I know I might get in trouble for that picture on the top left because it does omit 3 members of the septuplet, but I was kind of basing this on aesthetics when I was making these images. What you'll notice with President Moon, and this is not a political comment or observation against him or his government, is that when these Korean things achieve success abroad, the government moves very quickly to align itself, to associate itself with those products. So when somebody wins an Oscar, there's the president for the photo opportunities. You can see Son Heung-min there at the bottom, and I believe that's after just winning the Asian Cup, coming into the dressing room, obviously incredibly emotional, exhausted, adrenaline. There's the president for a photo shot. A lot of BTS fans, some BTS fans have suggested or pointed criticism at the government for simply using the young gentleman for photo opportunities at all the time. So in this point, I'm just trying to suggest that rather than being a government-sponsored thing that's pushed abroad, that's manufactured, it's rather the opposite. It's the international fans abroad that are naturally and organically picking this up because it's cool right now. And the government is sort of grabbing onto the pigtail, or the coattails rather, and trying to be successful through association, because the more Korean cultural products are successful under their watch, the more legitimacy or authority it might give them. The current administration praises Blackpink quite a lot in their speeches, the New Year speeches and such forth. Not seen any photos with the president yet. I'm not sure if I'm missing them, but I haven't seen them yet. I find that very interesting. In terms of K-pop, this shouldn't be an important question, but what is K-pop? It causes heated arguments online, and it seems like it's something rather trivial or insignificant when you compare to wider politics and world peace and terrorism and climate change and all of these things, COVID-19, but it's dealt with the same passion by a lot of people. And again, it's something that we find no consensus on. So I just want to explore this idea of what K-pop is, because more importantly, for most of us that entered this lecture today, or this talk rather, we would have all had an idea what K-pop is in our minds. And if we were asked to define K-pop or point out K-pop somewhere in society, we would have sort of backed ourselves to be able to do that. What happens though is when people start to pointing to different things and defining things differently, that's why this kind of postmodern analysis I think is very important, because we see little consensus in the definition of what K-pop is. Read the academic literature, read the mainstream press, look at encyclopedias, look at style guides, look in English, Korean, and one paper will say it's a genre. Another paper will say it's not. Another paper will say that K-pop is simply Korean popular music. It's really hard to put one's finger on what this thing is. Why is that? Why cannot, if all these people are talking, studying K-pop, why can't we ascertain what it is? Because for the most part, we're able to agree on definitions through consensus. Why does this one evade us? To look at it, I found it interesting to start by going to the stars themselves. So this is Jennie from the Blackpink documentary recently. And for her, K-pop is defined by the process rather than the output. So it's not what you produce, but it's how it's produced. It's the existential journey. It's how this takes place. So we know that K-pop, there are hip hop K-pop songs and pop songs and slightly rock songs, even country ones. But if you imagine, for example, a K-pop group, an idol group, they produced this kind of electronic country song. And then these 4 or 5 girls got together and started a band, and they produced exactly the same song. So the song is exactly the same. And it goes by the standard verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, key change. It's not the song itself that defines it as K-pop. It's that these people would have been trained, that these people would have gone through all of that, whether it's training on publicity, on dance, on speech, on dieting, on relationships, on no tattoos, all of those things that we know. It's that process which defines K-pop. So K-pop is this existential way of life rather than that which is produced. And that's why K-pop manifests in different genres, why it's very genre bending. That's Jenny's answer. If we look, for example, at Sugar or Tableau. Now, Sugar here is very interesting because this is Sugar from BTS on the left, and he has a couple of different personas. And I find it fascinating that at one moment he can have fluorescent pink hair, be throwing up love hearts, exuding soft masculinity, humble. And then the next moment he'll be releasing his own hip hop tracks in which he swears, says F you to everybody, boasts about his Grammys, his billboards, and his private jets. I find that dichotomy between those two identities really interesting. Sugar says that K-pop it's not the music, but rather it's an accumulation of everything. So it's the choreography. And I think that's a really important part of what defines K-pop a lot of the time. It's the performance, but more than that, it's sort of an audio visual package. Now, whether Epic High are K-pop or not, Tableau says doesn't really matter what we classify it as. That's something for other people to look into. Nevertheless, if we look at these pictures on the left and the pictures on the right, I'm sure most of us, perhaps many of us, would say that I see something different between these two things. K-pop does seem to exist. How we define it, whether we define it, is a different thing. But we seem to be able to point to something for the most of us, and we would say, that's K-pop, and that's not K-pop. If we take the definition that K-pop is anything Korean and popular, then that's all K-pop. However, if we look at it and we see a difference between the left and the right, then we're slowly trying to get somewhere. So who should we listen to? Is Inalchi K-pop? If it's Korean and popular? Well, I mentioned the idea about identity. Who do we ask for when we define these things? Do we ask the artists? Do we ask the citizens, the South Koreans? I find the differences in my responses between teaching international students K-pop and domestic Korean students, I find their answers incredibly different, and it's fascinating. Do we ask the international academics, the Korean academics even, or the international fans? Basically, who gets to decide or define what K-pop is? Do we need a definition of K-pop? Would it be based on knowledge or ethnicity or desire? How does that really come about? The more I think about it, I'd suggest that K-pop exists as something bigger than any single definition. K-pop is and K-pop isn't. That as soon as you try to cut this little piece and say, this is what K-pop is, then you're missing something over here and you're missing something over here. And people try to, specify K-pop according to their own interests, their own desires, their own occupations, or their bias in the fandom. But when we do that, we're limiting what K-pop is, because K-pop is bigger than a single definition. Moreover, I think it's something that K-pop cannot be controlled. K-pop is not on a lead. Yeah, K-pop can be sort of cajoled and sort of persuaded to move different ways by companies or stars or by fans. Nevertheless, K-pop is not under the direction of one singular person, because it is spread around the world, and therefore it's become sort of a multi-headed hydra or a chimera. It's become something bigger than its necessary parts. So where it goes from here is anybody's guess. Looking at the fans and going through some of the literature, whether you look at studies from Sweden, studies from Romania, studies from Israel, studies from the United States of international K-pop fans, a lot of these studies point to them being young girls. That seems rather natural, I would suggest. Pop music has generally been aimed at that. And if we were studying, for example, opera or heavy metal or crochet or whitewater rafting, we would expect different demographics. Nevertheless, we get this idea that there are a lot of young girls that are big fans of K-pop. You can get visual clues of that by looking at photos of concerts, of exhibitions, and such forth. The literature also, interestingly, in terms of identity, breaks this down into two major demographics. And again, this is something that I've seen to be backed up by my own experiences. Now, I can't define K-pop according to such a small sample rate, but when those studies suggest it, and my own experiences teaching K-pop to different international students, it seems there's something worth investigating here, that there's a white middle-class demographic that's very into K-pop. And the literature here will say that this demographic particularly are attracted because of the production, because it's so high quality, it's so polished, it's really sort of top-notch globally. It's hard to find better produced visually audio pop than K-pop. The aesthetics are on point. There's also, it would suggest, fetishization in that there's this desire for the exotic, the desire for the other. Some people try to downplay that sort of sexual aspect of K-pop, which I don't think is necessarily correct, because libido and that is really important to young people, and that's how a lot of this works. But with this white sort of middle-class fans of K-pop, the literature also suggests that there's a non-white lower class, and we shouldn't think that lower class is less, but that's just the terms in the literature to attribute socioeconomic status. But these fans of the same thing, they like it for different reasons. So this research suggests that the non-white lower class, so these would be sort of people who live in predominantly white countries, whether it's Sweden, whether it's Romania, the United States, they like K-pop because it helps them navigate their own identity, because it gives them alternative spaces to visualize a world that is, even if it's not them directly, say as Asians, but it helps them posit a world that is closer to their own existence than, say, a whitewashed Brad Pitt, Leonardo DiCaprio, and such forth world. They get to see different representation. They get to see this idea of decolonization that we can, or for them, it raises up different stars. So personally, I think this is rather fascinating that these fans are attracted to this thing side by side in the concert, side by side in the classroom, but yet it's different desires which bring them there. And perhaps some of these also might be living in different paradigms, and their identity will be different. So that makes K-pop really that fascinating thing. Now, in pointing out that a lot of these K-pop fans are young women, that sometimes gets a lot of pushback. I've seen it written as needlessly dismissive, part of a Western gaze. But I'm not particularly sure that that's a correct argument, because if young women like something, that doesn't mean it's any less of a valuable thing than if old men like something, or middle-aged people like something. Its qualities are not determined by the fans that it has. Moreover, it seems to me to sort of be denying the identity of these fans. It's trying to hide them. It will point to, yes, there are male fans, and yes, there are elder fans, and it should be made clear, yes, there are male, or yes, there are men, young boys who dig K-pop, and yes, there are older women who also like K-pop. Absolutely the case. But in terms of the overall demographics, it would seems to be sort of skewed towards that 65, 70%. Looking at the literature, they're the numbers that they sort of bring out, being young women. And I think it's interesting to sort of sometimes focus on that. That's the identity, and that's the people that are driving a lot of this, not solely, but to a certain degree, and that shouldn't be dismissed. The fans are not, however, passive fans. They're not just eating their popcorn and letting this go. Rather, there's all sorts of different words for this, but they're prosumers. People measure the level of fandoms by how engaged they are. Do they simply talk about something? Do they receive it, or do they create their own? Do they engage? Do they go on social media? Do they spread the word? Do they support their favorite people? And that's what a lot of K-pop is seeing at the moment. People are constructing new political and social realities through K-pop. When they do this, however, they're doing it from their own cultural background. So the way that K-pop fans in Eastern Europe and the way that K-pop fans in South America, Eastern Africa will all interact is incredibly different, because their backgrounds are different. And in South Korea, a lot of K-pop seems to be, it's simply music. It's something that we enjoy. It's there. It's part of the life from morning to night when you go in the shops. But for other people, it's a way to construct a new reality, to envisage the world as being different, to create new truths that can challenge existing power structures of gender and economy. So they're active fans. And because they're active fans, it means that in terms of K-pop, the narrative about what's being produced is not happening internally or domestically in South Korea. Now, when I teach South Korean students about these various things, a lot of them, for example, have never heard about cultural appropriation. It'll be a completely new concept for them, not because they're any less educated or any less turned on to things, but they just simply live in a different world where that idea has not become commonplace as it has elsewhere. Now, the big entertainment companies will put out a video for their latest group, and the ideas of cultural appropriation discussed about that video or that performance will not necessarily be in South Korea. It will take place in India. And when people discuss the gender fluidity of Taemin, the soft masculinity of EXO's latest thing, it won't necessarily really come in South Korea. It will come in different countries. It will come in Thailand. It will come in Costa Rica. And so I think it's really interesting that the authorship, how K-pop is being written, the narrative, the ideas that drive it are coming from external worlds, external paradigms, and external value sets. Now, the entertainment companies themselves obviously very well keyed into the global reception of their products. So yes, they want domestic success, but Korea is an export country in all sorts, including in culture. It can't survive if it just relies on domestic success. And many domestic fans of Korean culture feel sometimes somewhat passed by, because there's a big focus on the external markets simply because they're so bigger, so more lucrative. So we will see big entertainment companies, YG and such forth, producing these things, seeing conversations abroad about the way their work is perceived, the cultural issues, the social issues, and therefore they're going to start changing it not to accommodate the domestic fans, but rather the international fans. Moreover, no matter what they make here, it will be interpreted by people abroad. It doesn't matter what Hyori tries to do in her video. The authorship or the narrative will be created externally. And that's another reason why I think K-pop is kind of off the leash and that it's largely uncontrollable. Now, with K-pop, with the love of Korean things, and this includes, of course, Korean movies, Korean dramas, Korean webtoons, really never been more popular, and the statistics back that up. It's not, I would suggest, just because it's Korean, but for a lot of people, it's part of a new world order. It's part of this kind of decolonized world, this restructured, reimagined view where Hollywood is not number one, where that post-World War II situation gets reimagined. And K-pop is a really big part of that because it shows that it's not supporting the existing power structures. It's not supporting Hollywood and MTV with everything that's gone there, but rather it's going to support different avenues, different expressions. So K-pop is seen as a way of envisaging a new world, a different way of doing that. So it's part of a bigger picture in that sense, not just the Korean thing on its own. Now, the more success it has, in some ways, the less Korean it becomes. Now, this is not necessarily a new idea. The concept of cultural hybridity is very well researched in the academic literature. But it's very interesting to see that the international success, for that real international success, the less Korean it is, the more chance it has of that success. So Dynamite is a fantastic example because it was the song that got the BTS, the Young Boys or the Gentlemen, to #1 on the billboards. There was nothing Korean about it except their identity. Song written and produced by an English man, English woman. It was all in English. It sounded very much like a Western pop song, but simply the identity of BTS, and that's testament to how cool and popular they are, gets that song to #1. So the more popular these Korean things become, the less Korean they actually are. That's an interesting way to perceive these things. When we look at the music itself, there'll be, I think the media channels, and I write a column for the Korea Times, and I can tell that they've noticed this, as has everyone else, but myself as well. Regular articles about K-pop groups will get hundreds, thousands of clicks and views, and that's what media channels are based on. However, take a close look at what they're reporting sometimes. They're simply reporting how many clicks a video has got. It's got 900 million, or it's got 1 billion now. And then a week later, they'll report it's got 1.1 billion. They're simply reporting numbers. There's very little musical analysis of K-pop, which is very surprising because it's meant to be music. Shows that perhaps K-pop has sort of evolved beyond music into a broader cultural global phenomenon. But the musical analysis of K-pop is very sparse. It's simply not there, but it reports on how much interaction it's getting abroad. Now, perhaps that just demonstrates the popularity and the success of K-pop. Yet we have this concept called sadegi. Now, this might mean hoarding in some senses. This might mean that there's a shortage of toilet paper or masks and such forth. So therefore people try to hoard things. In the the Korean music or the K-pop world has a different meaning, however. It means to manufacture success, because in the last slide, I tried to express that now the success of a song is not geared towards the quality of the song itself. Nobody goes, wow, that song was amazing. That song blew my mind. That song was a revolution in the way things are done. That conversation is simply not happening. The conversation that's happening is that song got 1 billion views. That song reached a certain amount of plays quicker than any other song. Now, if that's what's taking place, we know this and I know this, then the production companies are going to manufacture those clicks and those views. We've seen that in South Korea, the Produce 101, the producers of that went to jail because they had rigged the whole thing. It seemed kind of obvious, but it was presented as this reality, make your own K-pop band, phone in and vote. Yet it was all, a lot of it was pre-planned, the votes were rigged and such forth. If you can achieve success by having clicks and views, well, then we get things like click farms or click-nojang. It's a farm where people will set up multiple phones. You can see it in the top left picture there. And quite simply, click, 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 keep clicking your video and you can buy these clicks. It's a lot cheaper to buy clicks, plays there than it would have been in the past to go to Hollywood producers or the Western gatekeepers of culture. So it's a lot more accessible now. Some stars have spoken out about it. You can see Tiger JK there saying, you know, I was asked if I pay this amount of money, I will have this much success. Some of the success is clearly bought. Other parts of the success, if you go online, you will see streaming guides for different groups. So the fans that are really into BTS, Blackpink, EXO, SHINee, they will have rules on how do you make the songs rise up, because it's not as simple as just pressing play and then pressing play. There are different things that come into this. I don't have it here. Let me stay on this one. So it's fascinating to see that they've created these do's and don'ts of streaming behavior. For example, you can't turn the music off on your tablet, your computer, because then it won't count the view. So if you don't want it to be noisy, you have to plug headphones in. You might have to delete cookies, sign in from a different account, don't use it from a playlist. There are all different ways that these fans have understood how to make every view count. And fans will stream 24 hours a day. That's the fans doing that out of love, out of passion. So when we look at the success of these things, again, it's not necessarily about the intrinsic qualities of the music a lot of the time, but it's about the numbers, it's about the industry. Now, part of this industry is just regular people clicking it. Wow, that's a really popular song. Let's check it out. Other people, very, very devoted fans who spend so much time going through these things with rules. Another part is perhaps buying these clicks, buying because it's a lot cheaper than doing it another way. A big story that we saw last year was K-pop fans taking over hashtags in the West, primarily in North America, in the United States. And we saw that they were sort of anti-Trump and promoting Biden, shutting down white supremacy things I'm sure we can all support. What you saw in the press, however, was that K-pop fans take over these things. K-pop fans are political. K-pop fans are doing this. This produces, or this increases awareness of Korea. This increases awareness of Korean culture. But primarily, it's not Korean people that are doing this. of course, Korean people are politically inclined and they have these ideas, but about the American political and cultural wars, a lot of young Koreans are not sitting at home with that occupying their thoughts and feelings. So K-pop is hitting the news, that Korea is hitting the news, but it's not the result of Korean people by and large doing this. It's a foreign or it's an external authorship, which is another reason why I think it's beyond the control of a singular source. It's another reason why I think that where the literature points to the demographics of the fandom being white middle class and non-white lower class, that would be reflected in the political activism that we see and the movements that they support and the movements that they seek to disrail. Again, I think that's a fascinating thing because it's boosting Korea without Korean people doing it themselves. The authorship is gone. That might be a good thing, but what effect does it have when it comes back? It would possibly seem like I want to look a little bit to the future of what happens in that. So on the screen, you will see here Alien by Lee Soo-hyun. I think there's a lot of good in K-pop, in the Korean things being produced. We've seen Sweet Home, that kind of webtoon drama, get great success, Korean movies getting great success, and the music. The quality of the products being produced here is growing. What happens with the international fans? Because we know that fans don't remain static because they age. And as fans get older, they become less passionate in general, or they seek to show their fandom through different ways. So I can see a stage in the future where the international reception of Korean products will decrease because we go through cultural shifts. At one point, what was cool was leather jackets and this, and then another thing, what was cool was long hair and grunge, and then another thing was cool and another thing was cool. At the moment, this Korean thing is really cool. It's wherever you go in the world, you'll see these fans passionate. But at some point, the new generation will come, and the new generation will not want to listen to what their elder sisters or brothers or cousins or aunties are listening to. Simply won't be cool anymore. That will perhaps return the authorship of these Korean cultural products back to South Korea. And I think that might be a good thing. When they do come back, are they going to bring with them a lot of these external values? Are they going to bring with them different paradigms? Are they going to bring with them multiple truths? So let's just wait till this one to load up. Can Korean cultural products be successful by being Korean? Probably. Will they? It kind of remains to be seen. If K-pop is held up by a lot of international fans, many of them with online, active, progressive values, do those then come down the slipstream back into Korean society and change Korean society? For better or for worse, but changing Korean society. Ideas come down, and that was one of the things that we mentioned at the start. People go through different paradigms through ideas as much as they do through technology. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether that reception will come two ways. It's also worth watching and observing how far these entertainment companies will go to seek profit, because in a neoliberal world, they're geared and they're designed to earn money. That's how they survive, and that's what happens. So if they realize that pushing certain values, ideas, and omitting other ones are good for the bottom line, how far are the Korean companies willing to go to push these things? Will they adopt what's happening in the West? Will they adopt what's happening in North America or South America, rather than listening to the voice of the Korean citizens here? I'm not sure. Perhaps they will. Perhaps that's just what happens in a globalized world, and perhaps it should be going two ways rather than one way. Nevertheless, just sort of coming to the end of this here, K-pop is sort of out of the control of Korea now. That might be a good thing and that might be a bad thing. K-pop is not defined by a singular person. It's existed beyond that. And so to suggest that K-pop is a political thing, to suggest that K-pop is a simply manufactured pop music, to see that K-pop is a way of decolonizing the world, it's all of those things at the same time. So K-pop is kind of like a looking glass. It's akin to, you look into it and you see what you want to see. So some people are going to see a reflection of values and identity. Other people are going to look into K-pop and they're going to see that production. Other people will look in and they'll see simply pop music, but it reflects back what the people want. And if it decides to become something, then it will alienate. If it really decides, well, this is what it is, if it focuses on appealing to a certain demographic, then it will miss all of the other audience. So it's by being that ambiguous, vague, appealing to everybody and allowing them to see in it what they want, that's how it retains a lot of the success. And that's why that definition, that understanding is very hard to parse. And finally, just that idea of identity, from my own experience looking at K-pop and Korean cultural music like that domestically, if I ask a class of 50 university students in South Korea, are you a member of any fan group or things like this, there's generally a lot of silence. By university, domestically, a lot of the fans, they've sort of grown out and they're looking for different things now. They've also grown up and they will have had K-pop their whole lives since they were young. So for the domestic fans, the presence of a new group is one that they've seen already many times before. Sure, as some of you know, as you get older, you realize that you've seen it before. I remember showing one group a Taemin video, and I said, do you notice all the Michael Jackson references? He's a big fan of Michael Jackson's dance and attire. And the students just looked at me and said, I kind of know who Michael Jackson is, but I don't get what's going on there with Michael Jackson. It's kind of mind-blowing to me to realize that sort of younger generations, things that were iconic for us, they don't see the references. So for many people, it's still new. Here, the fans tend to be a little bit younger. Of course, there are older fans as well, but in general, and also tend to be a little bit less political, a little bit less engaged, not using it to navigate their own identity, not using it to create a world in which they can understand themselves, their position in the world. And that's a good thing, by the way. If people are able to live more comfortably, that's a good thing. Whereas international fans, a lot of them, for them, K-pop is something that gives them hope. It gives them a new way of understanding themselves. It gives them a new way of picturing a better life. And that's a really good thing. And K-pop should be supported for that. Nevertheless, the identity and the way people approach it is completely different based on one's identity. I've spoken for about an hour on different things here, just riffing off my head with these PPTs. So I'll stop here. I believe there are probably many things that I haven't said. There are probably many things that people might come back at or perhaps disagree. But if anyone has any questions, any comments, any things that they would like to add or suggest that I misinterpreted, I'm always open and I'm all ears.
Well, we'll get to that right away here, David. Thank you very much for the lecture, the talk. I guess it's a talk. Okay, several folks have posted some related articles and items in the chat box, so I invite you all to look at that. To do the question and answer as effectively as possible, some of you already have discovered at the bottom of your Zoom window, you can go to the icon labeled participants, And in the bottom of that window is a little item to click that raises your hand. Now, Mac, I understand, is different, and I don't have one, so I'm not sure how that works. And I also know that on my smartphone, it's a little bit different, but somewhere in the box that pops up for participants, there should be a way to get to a menu item that lets you raise your hand. If you can't find that, and if your video is not functioning, whatever, please go ahead and type a question in the chat box, and I will try to get those all answered as we can in our time left available. So I'm going to call on Ananya Mahir. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi, Dr. Tizzard. It's Ananya from India.
Hello.
And I have been studying Korean language for about 4 years now. I have been exposed to the culture quite recently. So my question to you, Dr. Tizzard, is that so there are so many groups that we call fandoms. They kind of work here on WhatsApps, and they work on different. They have these different groups, and they sort of connect with each other, and they get this space that they can't get at their homes, sharing trauma, sharing all sorts of things that they can't share with their regular friends, as we would call them, but with their K-pop friends, the friends who have a similar liking, etc. So how do you look at that? How do you look at K-pop as a space for sharing traumas, not traumas, but I would say life experiences, rather bad ones, bad experiences?
It's a very good point, and thank you for your question, Ananya. I would suggest this is not just limited to K-pop at the moment. Previously, sort of looking at modern, postmodern dichotomy as I did earlier, previously, many of us were tied to a geographical location and to a certain culture. And so we would have grown up in a certain country at a certain time, and there would have been a culture around us. And some of us would fit into that, and some of us would not fit into that. It would cause problems of alienation or support because of the way things have gone online. And that's why a lot of studies of fandom is based on, as you correctly say, communication now across space. People are not confined to their own culture now. They can reach across the world, find people with similar interests, perhaps similar questions or similar things that they're trying to make sense of in the world. That's why I think a lot of the conversation around K-pop is that kind of existential thing. Who am I? What is my identity? And K-pop really does help them answer that. Groups will be created because of that. And this is all very positive. On the other side, it does sort of create in-groups and out-groups amongst the fans. It does create senses where, or situations where, to be a correct fan, you have to adhere to a certain way of behaving. You have to adhere to certain practices when you talk about them online. You have responsibilities. So I think it's both positive and negative. But what you're suggesting, Ananya, I think is just a sign, not necessarily only of K-pop. I think we would also find this in other cultures and other things that people are attracted to. And it seems to be a good thing because we can reach out and meet more of the world. What do you think, by the way, before I finish? Do you have a take on it or a different view?
I think I have first come to know of such spaces through K-pop only. I'm sure there must be, as you already mentioned, there must be groups or such spaces outside of K-pop for sure. But I got to know about it only because of K-pop. And I think it's a great space. I think it's a very positive, affirmative, non-homophobic, non-transphobic, non-ableist space to be a part of. I think, and I think in India and a lot of, so I come from a very humble background. It's a small town in Bihar. And I think in places like mine, so I think K-pop has given the people that access for Gen Z or the millennials also. K-pop is that driving force behind all these places. There must be such in the past, but for us, it's K-pop. It has connected us and it has given that space. I also, just before I finish, I have another question. I'm really sorry to keep other people waiting. How do you look at K-pop and language? So I'm a student of Korean language. And how do you think language limits or not limits the thing that goes on with K-pop? Do you think knowing the language limits how you understand K-pop or how you connect with it, or does it not?
I think I will answer that just in reference to what you said, that first point about how it provides a non-ableist, non-homophobic space and things like that. I completely agree that that's how many people see K-pop. And again, I think that's a very positive thing. What I want to suggest is that because of anything inherent in K-pop itself, or is that because of how fans are using K-pop as a tool to navigate their own identities? For example, if it was something else, if it were modern French cinema or electronic music, would it also be capable of doing that? Or is there something in K-pop that itself that produces that? I think that's a really interesting thing to pass. In terms of the second one about language, I've seen some artists say that they're not going to use certain Korean words because they might be interpreted incorrectly abroad. Words such as me and you, Psy used them very sardonically in Champion. I think that's quite strange that Koreans might limit their own use of their own native tongue to appeal to international audiences, or rather to not offend international audiences. However, there must be a difference in the Korean people. When they hear it, they're going to hear nuance. They get the metaphors quickly. They get the puns. They get the wordplay. There's no mediation between fans or translation. So I just think they have an easier access to it. It might make them like it less, Koreans, because they hear it and they go, that's kind of cheesy. I've heard that before. But for international fans, it might be, wow, that's kind of, they said the word soul, or they said the word destiny. And so it will be different, I would suggest. I hope that answers the questions.
Thank you. Oh, I was going to go to somebody else. Ananya, did you want to follow up with that?
That answers both of my questions completely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alana, you've typed a lengthy question in the chat box. Do you want to just talk about it with your voice?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much for such an informative session. I learned so much from today's lecture. I just have one question following up on your comment that there are two different segments of Korean cultural product that's being exported in the name of K culture. And you're saying that Korean culture and K culture is essentially very different. I'm curious to hear your view on what do you think are the main factors that determine what kind of Korean literature gets chosen as the representative Korean cultural product, as to the comparison with the movies and the Korean food and the Korean K-pop music. Because you said that, you know, it's becoming a little bit more opinionated and more revealing on the social issues, but I think that is also changing. So like, what I'm trying to say is that being opinionated part and kind of like exposing the social injustice and the disgruntlement among the Korean people, that's not the consistent theme of the fabric that gets exported in the name of Korean literature. So what do you think are the factors that affect or that determine what gets exported as Korean literature as a product?
Very good question, Alana. So thank you for that. In terms of, I'll come to Korean literature, you briefly mentioned sort of K-pop and Korean movies. I'm going to suggest, and this is not to be derogatory, that Korean movies have received and have done for a long time critical success abroad, whether it's Park Chan-wook and Bong Joon-ho. Their movies, even in the past, if they weren't sort of winning the Oscars, amongst movie lovers, amongst sort of the Cannes Awards, Korean movies have achieved critical success for a long time now, looking at a couple of decades. That's very different from commercial success, obviously. critical success being sort of given or bestowed by those in the field, commercial by more, let's say, the general public. K-pop is achieving definitely unbridled, unmatched commercial success. Incredible. It would be interesting to see whether K-pop can achieve critical success. Is it capable of writing an album, whichever group it might be, that gets remembered 20 years later, that people still bring up as being significant for something other than its commercial success? Now, so that's one difference I put between those two. In terms of Korean literature, I'm not sure if Brother Anthony's in the room or discussion at the moment. I might get in trouble with this. However, it's just my personal view, and I generally read Korean literature in translation. I've read a few in Korean, of course, but it doesn't seem as, I've read a lot of Korean literature, but I've never read anything that I've sort of gone, that's amazing, that's caught me. And I don't know why, to be honest. Is that just my own reception of it? Is that it's just I don't have the taste for Korean literature? Is it something intrinsic in Korean literature itself? Now, if we look at a recent success, you mentioned social issues, that would be Kim Ji-young 82년생, Kim Ji-young born 1982. Deeply important book for Korean society, for bringing to light the structural injustices regarding gender. I didn't think it was an amazing piece of literature. I thought it was an important book. I thought it was an important message. And as humans, Koreans have known these statistics for a long time, the gender inequality in society, but you can throw statistics at people for the longest time. It doesn't move them. You give them a piece of art, you give them a narrative, you give them a story, a movie, and suddenly it makes sense. It comes alive. We learn through that. So I think from my personal perspective, there have been some important pieces of Korean literature drawing and playing on those social elements. But in terms of its intrinsic qualities, and I say this with no disrespect, I have not personally found it yet, but it's not through a lack of trying. I've read a lot in English and Korean, but I'm not sure why, to be honest. Do you have any views, Alana, or do you have any sort of ideas on this?
Hi. Yeah. Well, I actually translate Korean literature, and we're trying to find those factors that would make Korean literature more approachable or more likable or more in demand, like the Korean K-pop or Korean food or the Korean movies. And my personal conclusion is that maybe Korean literature is really too Korean, unlike other genres of Korean cultural products that we're trying to export. I feel like the movies can be quite Hollywood in their delivery. And I feel like Korean food can also be modified to suit the taste buds of the Westerners. And I feel like the music is definitely a factory product that is very nicely orchestrated to the taste buds and the needs of, the Western audience who are into the Asian cultural product, like the stereotype of what they expect to be Asian. But I feel like Korean literature is just too Korean. And I feel like the global audience, they want an Americanized or westernized version of what they think is Korean, but they don't really want what is truly Korean. That's just my take. Yeah.
I think that's a very good point. But I read this last week and I loved it. And Soo Kim's The Plotters. I thought that was a very good Korean book. I guess what we have to recognize, Alana, you say that you're a translator, is that people don't access Korean literature. They're accessing the translator, whoever that translator might be, whether it's Jamie Chang or other people. When you listen to K-pop, you're getting it. It's unmediated. You'll have fan translations, but it's still, you're getting the original product. When you have the movie, you're getting the original movie with the subtitles. Now, quite rightly, Darcy Parkett's work on the Gisaengcheong subtitles were lauded because they helped bring to life the movie. If the subtitles hadn't been as good, Parasite wouldn't have been that much of a success because people wouldn't have understood it. So maybe it's the content, as you say, maybe it's too Korean. It's hard to translate the cultural, social relations here. You don't call your elders by their name. You have all of these different cultural rules. Maybe it just doesn't translate, maybe translations, that lack of immediacy. But fingers crossed, I hope it gets better. I hope to read some of your translations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. That's so kind.
Great, thank you. David, the chat box is just going bonkers. Let me read one from Lynn. I think it's interesting
Okay.
that non-Koreans point out the multi-genre structure of Bong Joon-ho's movies and K-pop songs as being innovative or radical. I would say that Koreans are also used to having many flavors, think cuisine. I seem to hear that you inferred that this was made for Western tastes, which I disagree. I guess the K-pop or movies were made for Western tastes is what Lynn's referring to. Any response to that? It's not specifically a question, but.
Yeah, I guess if Lynn's there, I mean, would you like to just, if you have a microphone, would you like to just explain it?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks,
absolutely.
Lynn. Yeah,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Yes. Yeah, no, I thought, I wasn't sure if I got what you said correctly, which I thought what you were saying, and I do agree with you about your point about K culture versus Korean culture. But I think that I thought what you were saying was sort of the multi-genre effects of K-pop specifically was more towards a tailoring for the non-Korean audience, like the Western audience. And I'd been to an interview with Bong Joon-ho, and there were similar questions to him about his, and people often point that out, that his movies are always multi-genre. And I just want to say, as a Korean American living in Korea, and that, you know, if you think about the Korean table, right, the cuisine, the whole point is there's always this contrast of flavors. And I think this is very much a Korean take, rather than what I thought I was hearing you say, which was that the multi-genre effect was really for the Western audience.
Okay, I understand your point completely now, and it's very interesting to combine cuisine and movies and music all together like that. For what it's worth, I completely agree in terms of that mixture, because more than that, religiously and culturally, you have influences from shamanism and Buddhism and Taoism and Christianity, and it all kind of goes together. You have the traditional and modern elements, you have the colonial elements as well. So I completely agree that mixture is here, and it's something that is very much part of the Korean life. In terms of the music, where I was mentioning that the genre bending, is that for Western tastes? Well, if you take Inalti, I've been a big fan of their work recently. They use pansori vocals and sort of EDM. I mean, that's kind of Korean. You know, that's really Korean. Does that work abroad?
But I think it's Korean for the point that you made earlier, which is that about sort of that nationalism, right? I think there is an inherent, like the whole idea of adapting the hanbok into K-pop, you know, costumes, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that there is that sense of nationalism, which is part of the, you know, the changing or using pansori or using traditional Korean equipment, instruments to make, you know, new sounds, if you will, right? So, I mean, I've been in Korea for a while, and I've worked in technology, and some of the approach of the innovation that people talk about with technology within Korea, a lot of that is a sort of a way of thinking that's very Korean, which is adaptive. And I think that that's what I wanted to say, is that adaptive, I feel like it has to do with flavor and so on, but I think that sometimes we look at culture and different artifacts of culture, and we silo them, and we don't really compare. And I like your approach, which is there is a sort of approach to, you know, the films and to the music, which is sort of adaptive and getting a lot of flavors within one go that isn't so new to Koreans, that may feel new to the Western audience, but it appears in there are permutations in other parts of Korean culture, as well as my point.
It's a very good point. I thank you for mentioning it, Lynn. It's very interesting. One of the suggestions that I was having is that K-pop means different things to many people, specifically the music here, not Bong Joon-ho's movies.
Yeah.
But that ambiguity, that structural hybridity, that merging of different things allows different people to see different things into it, and then produces greater success. I mean, if it stuck its mask down and said, we are this, and the BPMs go like this, and the production is like this, it would get more passionate fans, but alienate others. So I think in terms of the music, at least, that hybrid structure allows for more people to see what they want in it, and that brings more fans.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to ask Palak to ask his question, please. Palak, go ahead.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, I am Palak. I'm from India, and I have a question related to Korean dramas. Since I'm an international relations student and I work on Korean soft power in the South Asian and particularly Indian region. So I agree with your point about the less Korean things become, the more popular they are, which I feel is true to an extent about K-dramas as well. They're mostly cosmopolitan in region, although they do have some Asian values, which makes them popular in India, I feel. So how does it work when it comes to branding the nation? If it's more popular and less Korean, what do people who consume it think about Korea, end up thinking about Korea? What are your opinions about that?
Could you just, I want to be clear, could you just give me that last point one more time, please, Palak?
Yeah, so I was saying, if the more popular a drama becomes, the less Korean it is. What does that end up? How does that translate for Korea? What does that translate into perceptions about Korea? Say a particular drama is really popular, but it's not as Korean as say other dramas which are more popular in Korea. So what do people end up thinking about Korea in this case?
Yeah. Okay, very excellent question, Palak. I think it's different. It's important, sometimes to differentiate between the music and the dramas. And I made that point about the hyperreality, specifically towards the music. In terms of the dramas, if you take something like Crash Landing on You, even Itaewon Class, a lot of them, Itaewon Class perhaps a bit less, but they're promoting not necessarily Korean culture, but they're promoting an idealized fantasy version of Korean culture. Now, not a lot of people in Korea live like conglomerates, like chaebols, like heirs and heiresses to great fortunes. Not a lot of people are amazingly aesthetically beautiful and have all of these things. We're just normal. But the dramas present fables, the dramas present fantasies. So that's part of the success, I think. You watch a drama abroad and, after the first episode, the people have had sex 5 times, broken up once and done that. That's just the way it is. In Korean dramas, the whole series might, sort of come to the apex and they'll kiss each other like that. So in terms of reality, it's projections of these kind of fantasy things, but it works and they like it. What I found interesting, I'll just add this, Palak, is that recently Sweet Home has become very popular. So Netflix, because of COVID-19, we've all been online, stuck at home, therefore watching more YouTube, watching more things. Now, Sweet Home, this kind of horror webtoon-based drama, is really critical of Korean society. It shows the poverty, it shows this kind of the mental health, it shows the suicide, it shows all of these things that you don't necessarily see elsewhere. And that hasn't come out perhaps naturally. Without COVID-19, people don't watch that. So in terms of promoting things, these dramas, I think they're kind of, a lot of the time, Koreans still living out a way to get release from their own struggles with the economic disparity and things like this. So I never look at Korean dramas and say, yeah, that's Korea. It's kind of like a Disneyland version of Korea. I'm not sure how that helps you, but that's how I see the dramas.
Okay, thank you. That was actually insightful, because I was looking at perceptions of Korea. So these idealized versions, as you talk about, they lead to positive perceptions of Korea.
Part of the reason for the positive perceptions is because of the legitimacy battle with North Korea. They've got to present this image. That's not always the case. That might be a little bit of a Cold War attitude, but I still think that's influenced some. Korea likes to present this kind of idea. So it's a narrative for both domestic and international, yeah.
Great, thank you. David, we're running short on time. I'm going to try and get through a couple of questions that are on the chat box, and there's one more person who has raised his hand. Give a quick answer to this question, please. Is K-pop more of an art and culture phenomenon or more of an economic marketing evolution?
Depends if you study culture or if you study economics. I mean, genuinely, that's my answer, because you could definitely study the financial impacts of K-pop and what it produces, and the way money's intertwined into this neoliberal thing. It's definitely a part of it. However, on the other hand, it is also a cultural, social phenomenon. You can see some of the questions we've had, people from India saying it helps me navigate my own identities and I like this. So the point that I made during the lecture was, it is this and it isn't this, and it's this and it isn't this. It kind of depends on your own identity and your own desire. That might seem like that's a nothing answer. Maybe it's because I studied Taoism too much, but like, if you want to know what it is, you have to kind of see that all-encompassing thing and accept that it's nothing and everything at the same time. And as soon as you say it's just culture and not money, or you say it's money and not culture, you're deliberately omitting a very significant part of it.
Great, thank you. Another question from the chat box. Am I right to understand that Korean or that K-pop is particularly popular among females? Why is that?
Why most of the chess players in the world, men, I can't account for people's tastes, proclivities, but it'd be worth considering. So pop music for the longest time has been sort of gendered towards women. Now, is that because women have an intrinsic liking of pop music, or is it because pop music is created and designed to appeal to that certain demographic? It's definitely dual causal, but how do you pull that apart? Now, in my experience, a lot of K-pop fans are women. Now, in South Korea, I mentioned it's up to about university age, and I'll ask at university, 50 students, like, in K-pop, and they're kind of like, they're into Nicki Minaj and Selena Gomez. They're into the international stuff by then. However, you get a little bit older and you find sort of 30, 40-year-old Korean women, and they're into it as well, because it's that kind of reliving the youth and nostalgia and finding that. Nevertheless, there are men fans, boy fans, old and young, but predominantly, and the research backs this up, the academic literature from different countries as well suggests that, yeah, it's predominantly girls, young girls. But like I said, that doesn't mean it's any less worthy. I mean, that's a good thing. Young girls are awesome.
I'm going to go to Chris Che. Chris, go ahead and ask your question. This will be our last question.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie, for your insightful sharing about K-pop culture. I just want to make some couple of comments, even though I'm not really an expert in this matter, because we, as you mentioned, we should be very careful to use of the Korean culture and K-pop culture or K-culture, because since this Kim Dae-jung government in early 2000s, they actually had a big financial and policy support to promote the K-pop culture product things in Asia. And then we had this unexpected success of Winter Sonata drama in Japan and other Asian nations. And then this entertainment industry paying attention to, we may actually sell our product overseas with a big support from government. So each area actually went through the different paths of their current success the stage. But we should be very careful. Each aspect of a culture product's success path is very different from each other, even though it's some way it's related. And for instance, Korean literature, from my understanding, the reason they are not really very successful compared to other products is definitely it's related to translation. But one thing we need to pay attention is that each language's unique difference and characteristic, because Korean has more than 1 million words versus the English is about less than 200,000 words. Probably, David, you remember the last the Christmas, the Jimin's winter package 2020, and there was a big the discussion on the word sobok, which is an idiom form, the word that evoked an idea in sound, and because this is very difficult to translate, and in certain language, so still this is struggling how they actually find a better one to translate the Korean into English, so that actually they actually deliver the message the original writer to pass to the reader. And the Dongjunus is the Gisaeng-chung was very successful in that matter. So it was quite impressive to the world those who watch the movies. So I believe each success of Korean and K-pop or K-culture should be carefully reviewed, not necessarily as assessed as one product.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris, and thank you very much for the comments. I specifically didn't sort of go down the Winter Sonata route because I feel that was a different time, a different world, and I think that's been well covered by far more intelligent and well-researched people than me. I tried to keep it in the modern thing. At the beginning, I showed the developments of Hallyu, and some people see it as changing from dramas to movies. Some people see the regions changing. Other people see the output. So yeah, there are different paths to success. My point was to suggest that it wasn't government-led at the moment, but rather the government is hanging on to the coattails of this cultural success. One point I would suggest, and this is just my personal opinion, there is this kind of, I don't know if I should use this term, but self-orientalism, and where sort of Koreans will say, oh, we have this thing called Han and you can't translate that, you can't understand that, you know. And is that really true? I mean, Russian literature and Chinese literature and French literature, this is all translated in all very different idiosyncratic cultures and languages. And so I'm not sure that going down that sort of, you can only understand it if you have the sort of the blood or the experience is the way to go personally, but maybe that's just my external view, and the people inside know that better.
David, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating evening. Appreciate all of your comments. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate the questions, your participation. Would like to follow up on this literature question. Royal Asiatic Society of Korea has a monthly literature club that meets and discusses a translated version of some Korean novel or short story. Our next club meeting is March 18th, so just about a month away, but you may need that time because we're going to read a novel by Son Won-pyong. In English, it's called Almond. And it's a good-sized novel that'll need some time to read. So make a note of that, March 18th, 7:30 p.m., online with Zoom, our Korean Literature Club. We hope that people who participate will have read the book so they can discuss it. Please check our website and our YouTube channel where you can find recordings of past lectures and other useful content. Our next lecture will be Tuesday, 9 March, 2 weeks from tonight at 7:30 p.m. Join us by Zoom for a lecture from novelist Martin Limon. Limon spent 10 years in Korea with the US military. He was here from the mid 70s until the late 80s, 2 years at a time, back and forth to other assignments. And after he retired from the military, he became a novelist. He's published about 15 volumes of a police procedure murder mystery series set in Korea in the late 1970s, the early 80s, features 2 American GI criminal investigators. The books give the reader a rocking and rolling insight into the intrigues of times past in Korea. We look forward to seeing you then. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon.